Okay, very good. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Legat Architects Think Tank 2020 Resilience. My name is Ted Haug. I'm the Director of Design with Legat Architects. A bit of background about Legat Architects. Legat Architects and Company is a design practice specializing in planning, architecture, and interior design. Our firm's portfolio includes commercial, governmental, healthcare, higher education, hospitality, mixed use, pre-K-12, and transportation facilities. A bit of background about the think tank. The think tank is an annual symposium orchestrated by Legat Architects. Each year we invite authorities from a variety of disciplines to speak about trends related to their areas of expertise, as well as how design impacts those fields. This year's topic, obviously, is resilience. In ecology, resilience implies the capacity of an ecosystem to respond to disturbance or invasion by recovering quickly, adapting to change, and evolving to thrive rapidly. In this year of radical change, resilience is imperative to the survival of not just architects and designers, but also the human race. Just as a reminder, this session counts for one AIA continuing education credit. In order to receive a certificate of completion for attending, please leave your name and AIA number in the chat feature, and we will record those and send you a certificate next week. Today's topic is resilience in transportation, and we're honored to have Dr. Joe Schwieterman with us today. A little bit about Dr. Schwieterman. He is a professor in the School of Public Service, Department and Public Policy and Sustainable Urban Development Programs. He's an expert in the fields of public policy, transportation, and urban planning, and is the author of numerous books and peer-reviewed articles on the development of cities and transportation. Joe has consulted with prominent national organizations on planning and development issues and advised national trade groups and research organizations on trends in transportation. In addition to serving as a director of the Chaddick Institute, Joe serves as president of the Chicago chapter of the Transportation Research Forum. In addition to having published more than 40 technical articles, Dr. Schwieterman has authored 5 books, including The Politics of Place, A History of Zoning in Chicago, which won an Independent Book Publishers Award. His most recent book, Terminal Town, offers an illustrated history of Chicago's airports, bus depots, and train stations since 1939. And just as a personal plug, I read that book twice. It's a fantastic book if you're into history and transportation related to Chicago. Since joining DePaul, he has also published an illustrated history of planning for the Chicago region called Beyond Burnham, and a book about the abandonment of American railroads, When the Railroad Leaves Town, which was a finalist for the prestigious George Hilton Award. Dr. Schwieterman is frequently seen and heard on radio and television, making appearances on Chicago Public Radio and WBBM's Noon Business Hour. His work through the Chaddick Institute has also been featured in USA Today, Bloomberg News, and the Chicago Tribune, among other national publications. Without further ado, Joe, take it away.
Thank you, Ted, and excited to present today. I first want to make sure we get the screen set here. All right, is my screen shared, Ted? We ready to go?
Not yet, Joe. I'm not seeing it. Try again.
Okay, let me get that for you here. How are we doing there, Ted?
There you go. That looks beautiful, Joe. Go for it.
Well, look forward to presenting this today. It's a topic kind of dear to my heart. I've been in Chicago since 1981. I've lived through ups and downs of transit and really have studied the system as one of my research focuses. And today is going to be, I think, a little bit of a interesting take on what we've all lived through and how our transit system is pushing to become more resilient. So as Ted mentioned, we're a think tank at DePaul University. We do 4 or 5 studies a year. You might have seen our work. They're all mostly free downloads. We'd love to get you on our email list, but we try to educate the public about technical transportation issues and present it in ways that reach a broad audience. I have been to DePaul since 1991, so I've been here forever. But today's topic is a very specialized topic in some ways. The term resilience for transit is used in a very special, specific meaning. Typically, the effects of weather and climate change on performance, but also man-made threats, whether it's cyberterrorism, things related to vandalism. We also are seeing it more applied now to things about when there's issues pertaining to technical adoption that aren't done correctly, such as positive train control now in the transit system. We see transit systems aren't as resilient as they need to be. And it's really a pivotal topic. And this next chart picture shows that in some ways we'll see our system has a real advantage over other systems around the country. One, most of our L system is above ground, which we'll see is a pretty big advantage right now, maybe not during a tornado, but just about any other time. And we'll see, especially with snow, that a system that's built actually on trusses handles the snow better than on embankments and things. So we'll see the CTA, we'll see is a world leader in some respects for resilience, and we're behind in some other aspects. Same way with Metra, and we'll see in a minute that just in the last 4 or 5 years, it seems like the pace of once 100-year events are picking up in this region. And we'll see Metra in some ways is positioned well. In other ways, there's a lot of work to do, which we'll see. Now, I think this chart sort of sets a nice context. This is really the effects of climate change on different parts of the country. And for one, if you look in the West, you'll see the red being earthquakes. I think if you were to redo this map today, that wildfire color, which is yellow, certainly would be probably seen as more pertinent to California right now than even the earthquakes, given just the terrible things that are happening out there. And I'll describe what that means for transit in a minute. But the East Coast has just been battered. And we're in a position here where, we're facing severe flooding. Winters are getting more extreme. The extreme heat and cold seem to be rising. But flooding is really what's driving people's view of sustainability right now, because it affects them in a very personal and financial way in many ways. But overall, Chicago is sometimes described, and I say this carefully because nobody's a winner of climate change, but if there is migration due to climate change, due to just the devastating effect, Chicago is probably positioned somewhat better than the coastal cities, which we'll get to in a minute. Now, the reason this is so urgent is we know there's many factors that have caused this very frustrating decline in transit use since 2014, 15 roughly, where we're seeing a national dip in transit use. And this is due to a multiplicity of factors. People always ask why, and unfortunately, it's a laundry list. We won't go through those now. But a lot of the reasons: low fuel prices, active transportation options people prefer, of course, a lot of things with changing job patterns. But we also know that when systems aren't resilient and they face catastrophic failure, two things happen. One, people often never come back. And that unfortunately has happened around the country in some of the smaller systems where there's shutdowns and recovery takes years, if ever. But also, more importantly, people are reluctant to build a life around transit. So you want to park yourself next to a transit route, have either no car, maybe one car for an extended family, and use transit as a focal point. If there's any lingering doubt in your mind that this is not going to be a 365, 24-hour option, that option becomes less attractive. And we've experienced this in our region a number of times. I think the one you probably may remember most was the 2015 Yellow Line embankment washout, which kept the by Evanston, this links Skokie, the old Skokie Swift between Evanston and Howard Street, Skokie and Howard Street, excuse me, down for months and months. And it was a man-made, partially man-made problem, but it was a good indication that when systems fail, it can be, it can take much longer to repair if you're not, in fact, prepared with a clear resilience plan. This was a fluky accident, we'll see, but it seems like flukes are becoming more common now with the complexity of things. So I'd like to do is, and you can see Yellow Line up here, it's an appendage of the system. But just to walk through, I think, why our system has addressed resiliency and made a lot of progress while still having, say, some major challenges that we've yet to do. I'd like to start the story in 1957, which not a date that's seen as a great day in year of transit milestones, but this was the year we probably had our first taste, you might say, of contingency planning related to weather-related problems. This was a time when we had the Great Subway Flood. And this occurred when work was being done on the Congress Expressway, now the Eisenhower, became the Eisenhower. And you can see the median here, the transit line is being built. And in the process of building this, the pumps became filled with mud because they're building the Eisenhower, and it was dirt and it flooded. And that prevented the drainage of water into the pipe system and the pumps to put the pumps in the Chicago River, which goes into Lake Michigan. I've since been told that there was maybe a man-made failure to not open the locks up to make things worse. And so it was a man-made crisis. But one thing it did was it flooded the subway, which wasn't opened yet here on this portion. And you can see here the damage. But also flooded much of the Red Line and led to massive street closures around the city. Here's Union Station, which had its whole basement flooded. Much of the computer equipment, the mechanical equipment was in the basement of Union Station and was major damage. The trains were able to keep running, but it was an indication how things can spiral. This really should never have happened to have a flood like this, because we have the system where the Chicago River dumps into Lake Michigan. Lake Michigan is typically low enough that we can either open the locks, creates a lot of environmental damage, but it prevents downtown flooding. But when you throw in an unexpected problem like this, a man-made failure, you know that even the best of plans can fail. And Union Station will come into our story a little bit later. But with that, here's an example of flooding along the Milwaukee District line. The importance of flooding and pumping and gravity powered system, gravity design systems to relieve flooding. We have continued problems with the Congress Expressway since then. It's one of our, you might say, least resilient expressways because it's in a trough. And so it was a bit of a wake-up call, but not a lot done was to our system at this point yet. And if you flash forward to 67, and I actually remember this as a kid. I wasn't in Chicago, but it was famous years ago as the storm to end all storms. We had the heaviest snow in Chicago ever over a very brief period, 16 inches in a couple hours. It brought the system to a halt. I remember my father veered into a ditch, and the poor guy, every time we went by that spot, we was, oh, that's where Dad wrecked the car years later. But in Chicago, it brought things to a standstill. And the interesting thing going through this is looking at what this meant for transit is in the end, transit almost came out as a hero. That transit looked really, within a day and a half, the system was running again. It was a bad snow. It took a while to clear the tracks. You can see the bus system was in a state of complete disarray during the 6/7 storm. But the transit system ran pretty quickly after that, especially the rail system. And this is about the time I remember transit and rail was always seen as the all-weather mode. So at this point, we had the overnight parking ban, which we still have today. So if there's certain streets you can't park during the winter overnight to allow plows because of the mess. We also had rail really coming off as a versatile mode because it was kind of the salvation in some ways by being running in a few days. And that ethos for rail being versatile, we'll see ended up fading a while back because of new threats that rail wasn't prepared to handle. I remember this movie, you guys remember this one, called The Out-of-Towners, which was about a storm in New York, and rail was the only thing running, and it was a mess. And it was an example of how weather can, I think that's Walter Matthau is in the movie, and it was just a great, almost advertisement for our rail is more resilient than other modes. But unfortunately, that image of rail, and maybe it lulled us into a false sense of confidence that we had the great storm of December 31, 78, New Year's Eve, into 79. And this is really where Chicago's vulnerability non-resilience became, unfortunately, wide open, exposed. And this storm began on New Year's Eve, but it was a series of storms, we'll see. And this was right, a lot of you Chicago aficionados remember when Blandick, the mayor, was running against Jane Byrne, the upstart, and this storm effectively catapulted Byrne's campaign into folk hero status of being somebody going to do something about the terrible incompetence of our city in clearing the streets. So we had days and days of gridlock and non-moving streets. But from the transit system, we'll see this was really the moment that Chicago began its ascent to become, in some ways, a troubleshooter. So this was a terrible 2-month-long thing. The Powdery Snow, this is from the Chicago L website, which is a great site for. But we quickly saw the limits of our cars. That one, the powdery snow was sucked right into the traction motors. And electric power, these are sort of rotary motors, and choked off ventilation. So the system really, running these cars in the snow, really exposed a weakness over a period of time. And this was like, brought Chicago to its knees. I mean, offices were closed, and we'll see here with the CTA came up with some improvised snow plows. A lot of these were created on the spot. Some were just designed in CTA shops ahead of time. And this proved to be a really bad idea to run these things. Sometimes they just ran the cars without snow plows to try to clear the snow with the weight of the train. And and this is a kind of a remarkable thing. We ended up having 84 inches of snow that winter, which is twice the average, 47 inches on the ground for a portion of it. And this drug on for weeks. I didn't move Chicago until a few years later, but everybody was still talking about the legacy of this. But one remarkable thing happened, and this is an amazing statistic. Between the snow and the extra burden put on them by the blizzard of '79, again, it was 78 and 79, nearly 100% of the car's traction motors failed within the next year because they didn't get the air intake they needed. They had the moisture coming in from the snow, and almost half, at one point, almost half the CTA cars were out of service because of the snow. Here's a stack of traction motors in Skokie. But the system was just shown its utter vulnerability to this, incredibly expensive, and transit for the whole year was down because of the disruptions in service. And what we saw from that was CTA really set out, it took them decades, I think, to reach this status. Look at the car on the right, that's one of the older heavyweight cars in the system. And you can see there's no design for snow removal. But if you look at the CTA car on the right, and you can see we, in some ways, became a world leader in having pilots, they're called, at the front of cars, kind of like cow catchers to the old steam engines, to clear the snow. And these are now standard on CTA equipment. We also have special devices to clear the third rail before the conduits touch the third rail to reach the power, which is another innovation. When Chicago does something, we buy so many cars that we can afford to experiment with new designs. We also began new kind of air intake because with the snow coming into the traction motors, it would clog up in the air intake. So you see all around cars, new kind of air intakes. You'll see one here on a car that's a mid-car air intake. And so the CTA became in many ways a pioneer of dealing with snow, and we really learned the hard way. And we'll see it took a while to get the system down. But with that, we've made special designed snow blowers, which you'll see on the system. Those are the third rail brushes I described, and there's a rotary snow plow in the back. So the 78, 79 storm really began this push to custom designed CTA cars due to our weather. Also on the snow plow, and I say this being somewhat of being an environmentalist, that one legacy of that is, we got the best system of snow plows and sand trucks and salt trucks in the country, you might say. And then kills me to see we get snow flurries and we have tons of salt being poured onto our street just to prevent the 5% chance this could be the worst storm than we thought. So there's some environmental cost to having sand and salt is being dumped the way they are, but it's politically seen as imperative from the lessons of '79. We also have a system now prioritizing much more sophisticated system of snow emergency plans. Of course, you can't park on streets, certain streets when we have snow emergencies coming, so is expected. That's a legacy of the system as well. So Chicago with the winter, but really, we'll see, really has been a leader. Now in '92, we had the next crises. And I was actually at DePaul during this, and this was the Great Chicago Flood, which was done by pilings being driven in the Chicago River up near Kinsey, near the merchandise market. You can see on the right there. And boy, this was a disaster that was almost 100% man-made, but it exposed, we'll see in many ways, our inability to understand the engineering of our system and to properly manage for human error. And what happened here with these pylons was they were being driven into the river to create a support, and they punctured one of the tunnels that were built years ago near the early 20th century that linked all the rail stations, kind of a system of underground tunnel system that did things, moving coal, moved commodities and things between the loop train stations and some of the big buildings below street, seen as a very environmentally cutting edge thing at the time. Those were abandoned when the rail system, passenger trains diminished, but that tunnel system prevailed. And when flooding got into those tunnels, it really almost was an embarrassing set of compounding problems that devastated many building systems that were built below grade. Here's a couple pictures of that from one from the DePaul era. But for example, I direct the Chaddick Institute, and many of the Chaddick records were lost because they were in the basement of a building on Madison that were flooded. And so once the tunnels flooded, the water rose, almost to the level of the Chicago River. So anything below grade was damaged. And for a transit system, we had transit outages. Of course, the subways were badly affected by this, but it created a lot of issues with just unsafe electrical conduits down there, with control systems being below grade. And so it was a real indication that unanticipated problems are almost as bad as things you probably can anticipate, like weather. And it was an amazing day. I remember fairly new at DePaul, and just thousands of people heading to the train stations in late morning to go home, saying, "You must go home. We have a flood." Nobody knew what was happening. And with that, here's another picture around DePaul. You can see just the water coming up from one of the manholes. But it really made clear to us that we're just stacking infrastructure on top of each other in the city. You have decades of infrastructure, from utility corridors to tunnels to private easements to above ground telephone poles with substations, and we had sort of lacked a plan to troubleshoot if some aspect of the system was overlooked. And we'll see here we ended up putting bulkheads on the tunnels below grade. A lot of changes were made where people ceased using basements, which is probably a bad idea to start out with in our region because we're so flat and we have trouble with drainage. So the system, and interesting enough, Union Station installed massive pumps after the 1957 flood, but 2 weeks before this disaster, I was talking to Mark Walbrun, and he said that they decided to move that stuff out of the basement, saying we had a flood in 57 while we have the pumps. This is probably not a good idea. So Union Station, most of the electric circuitry was moved above to the second floor. The trains kept running. So the Chicago flood is deeply etched in our need for layered analysis of our infrastructure before we take action. But I will say it wasn't until 2012 that the word resilience came into common use. I don't remember personally using this term until after the 2012 crises that put to shame everything. It wasn't Chicago, but it was the effects in New York and the East Coast of Hurricane Sandy. And the remarkable thing about this is we knew this was coming for days, and we could take actions to get people out of harm's way, but there was virtually nothing we could do to limit its effects. We can get the equipment put at the high ground, we can do our best, but when it came to the storm surge with Hurricane Sandy and the age of the infrastructure in New York, we had an outcome that was just staggering. Here's some of the fires that emerged. You can see on the bottom right there, subway was flooded. And it wasn't the damage from the hurricane itself as much as it was from water flow that came with that, with the rising sea level already, New York being very low altitude to start out with Manhattan. And what happened in New York is something we really didn't have ever during any of these crises in Chicago. And that was a sustained severing of the entire transit system. So if you're familiar with New York, you probably know that southern Manhattan is just a spider web of transit lines. The minute I think I know New York's transit system, I'm there and I discover a line that I didn't really notice before. It's just so vast. And a whole series of lines like in New York to Brooklyn, all of those were damaged by Hurricane Sandy. But the remarkable thing about this was, they had the lines running again, within a few weeks or months, depending on the line. But that was only the beginning of Hurricane Sandy's effects, that they found that, 80-year-old signal equipment and mechanical devices that ceased being made years ago, and the effects of leaking tunnels that should have been addressed decades before, all of that lingered. In fact, it still lingers for today. So you look at New York, not only did it cause a short-term crises that Manhattan effectively shut down because of southern Manhattan because of that, but they found that they were cursed with years and years of unreliable transit and the need to shut down lines for weeks at a time to retrofit systems that should have been attended to years ago. And, you can imagine in New York the scale of this, but we saw with Hurricane Sandy that when things do get completely submerged, here's a escalator at one of the South Manhattan stations. You can see how high that water came up. I mean, not only did it flood the tracks, but it crossed the platform with 5 feet to spare, which, when old equipment exposed to water for that limited period, you can see where short circuits, accelerated rusting and depreciation is going to happen. So, while they got the tunnels drained and they could run trains at somewhat reduced frequency for a while, still today they're working to try to get the system back reliable. They had the Summer from Hell a few years ago, which was famous in transit circles because everything bad happened at once. Penn Station's problems, the subway problems. And they're finally digging themselves out of that. Of course, COVID creates a new challenge of how it's all going to be paid for. But it really rocked New York, and it started this whole movement that we have to quit looking at problems one at a time. Here's another picture of just some of the damage. That we need to have full-blown resilience plans. And we'll talk about how this is more than just putting in the right equipment to prepare for disasters. It's actually to expect the kind of disasters that nobody saw coming. New York actually had 2 100-year floods in 4 years. They had Hurricane Irene, I think that was 2011. And then 4 years later, they had the second 100-year flood, which pretty much, if you're a statistician, would say we can reject the hypothesis that the 100-year flood concept is correct. If the second one comes within 3 years, maybe it was a real statistical fluke, but I don't think people are thinking that anymore, that all our models are wrong about severe weather. So when we saw the resilience planning take effect, we saw a whole series of things happen. And I'll just say in 2014, the last thing in Chicago, we had the polar vortex. And those of us who are around and you transit users, this is all the moment we said, why am I living in Chicago? And I just remember weeks and weeks of walking to the train and just crunch on the hard packed snow. And, you know, one day looked like the next, and it's dark by 6 o'clock. And it just seemed, and the transit system had big problems during this period. Mainly the electric line, which I used, was over in the South Shore line. We'll see the electric Catenary had problems, but buses were freezing up. Wasn't a disaster system-wide, but it was periodic outages. And here I'll talk in a minute, we were lucky to have, and I'll describe more about this in a few minutes, is this really remarkable system of gas-powered melting devices on our switches and crossings for railroads. And we'll see there's nothing else quite like this in the world. People, I till a few years ago viewed this as a man walking around with kerosene, dumping kerosene and lighting it, but this is now a fairly sophisticated gas-fed system to keep our switches in play. So after 2014, we kicked into high gear planning for this. And we'll see it's a remarkable, unique Chicago thing that's, photographers love it because it looks like your railroad's on fire, but it's actually a sort of planned melting. But one thing we had with this, which I think helped, is we had the PACE system of running express shoulder operations on buses during this crisis. And we had lots of snow, and during snowstorms, you can see on the right, the PACE 855 bus is move along, I think 35 mile an hour or so is the maximum speed, but it really showcased how that type of institutional arrangement really can keep a transit system moving in bad snow. So that system has accelerated quite a bit in the last few years, and it proved really well in the vortex, which was some of the early days. So what I'd like to do now is just go for a few minutes to talk about why I think resilience planning is urgent, and why it's not just a buzzword, but it's something that really is at the core of a lot of the management strategic plan. And the first one you all know, I know we have a lot of architects on the line, and this keeps everyone busy, just the aging of our infrastructure. Everything's getting old. And while we're modernizing, you know, we all see the civil engineers to give our infrastructure a D+. Always think they're just a little bit harsh, but we certainly deserve a grade that's, in my view, below a C. But anyway, it's a real weakness of the United States and Chicago in particular with our legacy systems. And so if you look at why the L often has operational problems, it's a different problem every day because of the age of the infrastructure. And so this has really accelerated that we have bridges now that are 100 plus years old. We have embankments that need shoring up. We have superstructures the L is on that gradually need repair. And it's just almost an overwhelming problem. We're making progress on some fronts and probably falling behind on some others. So that one's pretty obvious. The next one, though, I think most of you would agree that the threats are just getting more diverse and intense. I mean, for one, we have technological interdependence, where now everything has to work perfectly in a very complicated system. The Metra system has to work, the CTA's GPS system has to work, the positive train control has to work, and there's a whole set of things that are in many ways interdependent that make it more complicated now. So in the 6-7 snowstorm, much of the L was run downtown on visual cues. So the motorman on the L would just make sure he doesn't hit the train in front of him with safe spacing. Now it's all done with signal systems, and human discretion is much less. Well, that's great if the system's working, but we can see where we're just much more dependent on systems working at the right time. Spontaneous social action. This is, of course, a longstanding issue for transit, but we're seeing it this year with the decision by the mayor to raise the bridges and close the subways. on moment's notice. How do we plan for that? How do we build a system to get people around downtown? If downtown is closed, do we just shut it down? Do we run bus services around downtown when we have conditions, unsafe conditions there? Cyberterrorism, you know, and this is something that we're hearing more and more about, of how this can in fact bring our system to its knees. And of course, climate change. You could add more things to the list too, such as new possibilities for human error in this equation. And we're seeing the complexity of dispatching our system exposes us to a lot of things maybe we didn't have a while back. So the third threat is our decreasing intolerance for risk. So my sense is, even if we had the same snowstorm we had in 1967, today we would be slower to get those trains running again, because we're less willing now to expose people to any sort of risk. And we see this all kind of places when there's, say, a grade crossing accident. In the old days, they would let people detrain and jump a cab. Now people are kept on the train because it's not safe to let them off, and they may sit there 3 or 4 hours because we don't want to take the risk. And I'm not criticizing that decision. It's just sort of a fact of life. We shut system down quicker when there is concerns about some aspect of safety. If we see safety defects on a line, we'll shut it down much quicker. Whereas in the old days, you know, we might have slowed the speed down and you know, took some chances. Today, when things go bad in transit, they can really go bad fast because there's concerns about relaunching service without every I dotted and T crossed. And we have to accept that that's the way it is now and plan for that. So, so resilience is more important now than it was before, because 3 foot of snow will have different implications for how we run the bus system than it did back in the 70s. And this fourth one I point out, not to make it cynical, but we have to accept the fact that the share of the population using transit, while we're in Chicago, a great transit city, and it can't function without transit, is low enough that political actors don't take action immediately when problems occur. And things drag out. We're often second line to schools and expressways and airports and neighborhood issues because the constituency for transit doesn't have the clout it might have had 30, 40 years ago. So you almost have to plan for the fact when the system has problems, we have thought through how we're going to solve it rather than expecting a political infusion of funding or push from the governor or mayor to solve this problem overnight. And I think we saw that like with the yellow line, that when it went down, we just had to fix it cost effectively. We couldn't throw resources at it to get that line running again real fast because there just wasn't the, you might say, the high level support for dumping a lot more money into a problem because of the priority where transit is in the minds of a lot of politicians, which is a subject for another lecture perhaps. So when we look at the sustainability system, we can see we're making some pretty good progress in some areas. In other areas, we're still pretty deficient. One, I would say we did a great job. The whole CTA system now is third rail. And it was 2004, we converted the Skokie Swift yellow line from electric overhead catenary to third rail, which really has improved reliability during extreme weather events. And that's a line now that has a lot of momentum with some new stations, and some things like that. We also, the South Shore line did a complete replacement of their old catenary system. And it's been a major gradual project, really to watch the South Shore line go from this kind of sleepy interurban to a pretty cutting edge urban railroad. And you probably, some of you may know that this year they're going to start the new branch that's going to run the Westlake corridor down to Munster, which involves reclaiming an abandoned railroad route. And that's going to be diesel power, but the trains will enter the main line and use electric to reach downtown. So the South Shoreline is really exciting to see at a time when there's so little new rail projects happening. It's I got that in a double track project, and it was being done in very interesting, successful stages. And the CTA and Metra now have power redundancy on their electric lines much better than they used to, so we don't have the outages when we have a substation failure. So that's, I think, pretty good successes there. As I mentioned, I still want to get my camera out in the next snowstorm and see the industrial beauty, you might say, of our system of gas-powered flame switch warmers that prevent snow accumulation in our switches, which is a terrible problem because one piece of solid ice landing in a switch, can bring Union Station to its knees. And with trains going over, snow falling off the trains, it doesn't take long for a couple switches to get bottled up. So these are fed by power gas lines. They're watched by an observer, a track inspector. And it's funny, the benefit cost analysis, we lose a couple cross ties every year from burning. That's a small price to pay to keep the system running. You'd think there would be a different solution than flames, but it's serving us pretty well. But more importantly, Union Station has this massive overhaul underway, and it's being done in stages. There's all kind of issues with the station now, from ventilation to older concrete that needs replaced, and Amtrak and developers and Metra have been gradually improving Union Station. The Great Hall looks great now, and some of the latest efforts focus on the track design. Well, one thing that makes life so much better now, I think we're seeing this in COVID, is we have all these other options that we didn't have. I just put scooters up here. That we have the second scooter pilot that's happening now, but we also have car sharing. So we have Zipcar all over town. We lost Car2Go last year, which was a shame because they were a different model than Zipcar, where you just paid by the minute. We also have electric bikes that are being deployed. We have, of course, a system of bike lanes. So in some ways, when the transit system goes down, we have much better ways to get around. We're seeing this during COVID when it's transit's running, but people may not feel safe. They are using these alternative options. Uber and Lyft are part of that mix in a pretty big way. And so it's not quite like 78 where you got two options, transit or drive or walk, because biking was so trivial there. We have to view active transportation and micromobility as a pretty good escape valve. Of course, that doesn't do you much good when it's below zero to jump on a scooter. But COVID's mostly been a warm weather phenomenon. We also have our city, you might say, one of the world's leading system of cameras, sensors, and smart city initiatives all over downtown. We have these installed. I don't think yet they're being used to the full extent, but that's the idea, is to get the data out there. We can track speeds and delays and unique problems for downtown with these initiatives, which is something the Manual administration really put a priority on. And this is a strength that we have too that you often don't appreciate, because it doesn't work this way in San Francisco, New York, Washington. We actually can divert trains to other routes very, very successfully. And I think the best example is, Red Line trains can be diverted to the Green Line, coming in down the purple and green lines to get through downtown on the L, and vice versa. If the loop Green Line goes down, with hardly any major problems. People got to walk through extra blocks. There's some confusion, but many times a year, this will happen, where we'll have an accident or incident in the subway or on the L, and the transit will be diverted. Plus, the pink line also can be diverted to the blue line subway, and that gives us remarkable flexibility. There's one downside with this, and that we have decided, and I think rightfully, but it's a painful trade-off, to have all our transit cars have to be built to be operational on the L. And to do that, they got to take those sharp curves on the L, which means the cars have to be very short. So we have some of the shortest transit cars in the country, which limits standing room. So we have terrible crowding, at least we did pre-COVID. And one solution might be to have longer cars where you're wasting less space on the switches and the vestibules between cars, the couplers and the vestibules. But to do that, then you lose this flexibility. So we've decided as a system, CTA, to have all cars be L capable. So that's a downside. But the flexibility is really remarkable. In New York, San Francisco, there's nothing quite like it, which is a great thing. You can see here in the loop just the complexity of how we have those kind of options, which is a remarkable thing. And a bonus, I'll say, we're doing really good at O'Hare and Midway, especially at O'Hare with the runway expansion plans. It's not transit, but it's indirectly related. With the runway expansions essentially being complete, now moving to the new global terminal, going to be built for Terminal 2. You know, things are happening out there that are really good. So I'll call this works in progress. You might say these are weaknesses or challenges. It's you know, some of these are fixable without lots of money. Other things are just facts of life we have to contend with. First of all, the Metra locomotive fleet is pretty old. And you see an F40 on, I think F40 on the left. Most of those have been retired now. There's still a few being used. And Metra is kind of a national leader in refurbishing old locomotives because our money, the capital budget hasn't allowed us to buy new equipment as frequently as we should. But you know, you come with that, you get reliability problems, particularly when the weather gets severe and things like that. So we've had, you know, locomotives stranded and flaming and all kind of questions. And recently we bought used locomotives to replace other used locomotives, and it was a financial reality. So this is where the financial cliff that Metra and CTA faces rears its head. So I think things are going better now with the locomotive fleet, but it's certainly every year some of the urgency rises. We also have the inner crossings that we're doing a good job with Create, the system to fix unclog our rail system, but we have so many issues that this is A2, which is the intersection where all trains coming north out of Union Station cross most of the Chicago Northwestern trains coming out of Union Station. And I'm told this is like the perfect worst case where cars rock going over this intersection, all the snow falls off it, or much of the snow, and much of that snow lands right on top of a switch. And so we get a snowstorm and suddenly it's like, you know, accumulating snow on this from trains crossing, and our gas-powered system can't keep up. When A2 goes down, the whole system becomes dysfunctional. So it's a good example of where lots of modernization is needed to fix these kind of things. A2 is up north. You can see maybe the Western Avenue area in the back there. We haven't done a great job in our region giving priority to buses. And you see this during snowstorms where the streets are clogged and buses are sitting in traffic. A few bus rides I've actually got out of the bus because I found walking was faster than it actually was. But the RTA has a big system now to do signal prioritization, Ashland and Western, 100 miles of routes, 18 projects. So it's going to happen, but we're playing catch up there. And thankfully this project is moving ahead, but it's something we're behind other cities on. We have some problems with relationships between railroads and public agencies. And I won't get too specific here, but it's never a good sign when people are suing each other. Let's put it that way. We have a couple examples like that. And, you know, Amtrak is breathing down CN's neck for on-time performance. Metra and Amtrak at Union Station, there's some disputes. Union Pacific wants out of the operation of its commuter trains. So Metra are going back and forth. And it's just an unfortunate reality that we're not always one big happy family, and that makes resilience much more difficult. So I'm down to my last 2 minutes here, and we'll open up for questions. Positive train control. This is the big mandate from the federal government, and I'll say in 5-10 years, somebody look back and say, we're so glad we did this, but right now we're still in the painful stage where massive resources are going to this safety system, and it does one thing well. I mean, it really prevents collisions and human error and so forth, but it doesn't solve many of the other problems we have and diverts money from those other causes. Metra has got going to meet the deadline, but I have to say that it's at the moment, it's created a pretty, added a lot of complexity to our ability to respond flexibly to emerging situations and threats because of the difficulty of adhering to all the mandates of positive train control. Our viaducts and bridges continue to get older. Here's a success story, the Metra bridge over the Fox River, which was a big project. You can see just driving around that we have a lot of work to do there. And our pumping systems, you know, a lot of this equipment dates back decades. If we were to have another major flood event, could our subways stay dry? Hard to know. Underpasses, below grade systems, a lot of the equipment is really aging. And so we have big vulnerabilities there. So I want to thank you all for a chance to present today on a topic that's a little bit different twist and maybe get you ready for wintertime, which is coming. And just in closing, I want to invite everybody to an event we're having in about 2 weeks. We'll look at how out-of-service railroad corridors are being brought back into service around the country. If you want to attend that, it's a evening event. Just email Chaddick at DePaul. Well, Ted, I think that's it for me. Do you want to kick into Q&A?
Well, thank you very much, Joe. Very informative, great webinar. Really appreciate it. And we got some really great questions. I know some of this is already happening in the city, and this is one question. Should some surface roads be converted to bus bike only to ensure greater speed and public access?
Great point. I mean, if we have the loop link downtown, of course, which is sort of a shared bus road system. And the grid really is an amazing thing. And despite angst in Ashland Western about bus rapid transit, about taking lanes away, mostly the grid can handle diversions of traffic for these kind of things. We've been slow to be too aggressive on this, partly because stoplight synchronization, if we create bus lanes and things, there's a lot of moving parts to get lights signalized correctly. I do think we're going to see more of this, maybe not a full pedestrian street, but calming a street so you just have a lane of traffic in each direction, you know, for other modes.
Interesting, interesting. Another question, should there be greater multimodal interconnectivity between regional transit and localized travel to increase access?
Oh yeah, great topic. And that's, I was going to mention that's in a way something we're maybe not leveraging as much as we can. That, you know, if the blue line goes down, we have the Metro Northwest line, which stops parallel to it in a couple places, Jefferson Park and Irving Park. But the mindset of people is these are separate systems, and people on the CTA don't venture to Metra and vice versa. Partly because they're designed to be so autonomous. We don't have a single subway or L station at any of our major commuter rail stops. So they're like these two overlaid systems. Now we're making progress. The agencies are, you know, working together. We have signage and we have experimental programs, and maybe we'll see something on the south side with the Metro Electric and CTA cooperating. But it is a real work in progress, not having these systems being more closely connected, and I think that's going to be a big push with the Regional Transportation Authority and so forth coming ahead to make them work together. And they have some really cool projects underway, but it's a lot of work to do.
Here's another kind of interesting question from our Columbus office. In cities like Columbus, Ohio, that rely solely on a bus system, and there's many kind of mid-sized cities that do that. What are the different strategies for transit system resiliency compared to Chicago, which has multi modes of mass transit?
Yeah, great question. Columbus is interesting because they got the big federal grant to experiment with smart transportation options. And it was probably a good choice because their transit system, I'm told, is quite good. The bus system is quite good, but there's no rail. I think what we're seeing around the country, we've had so many years of consecutive declines of ridership on bus systems in mid-sized cities like Columbus and below, that they're feeling urgency to think outside the box even before COVID. So we're seeing a lot of cities, I did a paper on this, work with Via Transportation, which is a micromobility operator, Uber and Lyft, try to fill gaps in transit deserts with on-demand service. So for $2, you can ride, you know, a Lyft line or a Lyft shared vehicle to the transit stop. And you can do that on one app. So you pay $2 extra and you have a seamless connection to have when the transit system isn't running. So maybe they shut down at night, you have a guaranteed ride home program where employers work to allow people that commute by transit to take a Uber, Lyft, or taxi. You don't leave taxis out of this home 3 or 4 times a year. So you can build a life around transit, but you know if you're gonna have to get stuck and work late, you're not gonna have to pay $50 out of your pocket to get home. So I mean, they're really trying to, I guess, augment transit. So it's not just a transit versus car dichotomy, but these other micro modes may play into that. And I think in our city, one place we're going to really feel opportunity is scooters, that we'd love people to take scooters to the L, but unfortunately they pay $275 for the scooter or $350, whatever it is. And then they pay the, you know, the $250 to ride the L, and suddenly it's, you know, it's a $12 commute and they're only coming from, say, the Austin neighborhood. So it's integration may be the next big frontier, and COVID may accelerate that.
Excellent, and we'll have to leave it there. Joe, thanks so much. The presentation was excellent. We really appreciate it. I want to remind everybody that we are going to have a roundtable discussion on Friday that Joe is going to be part of, so feel free to send additional questions to Justin Banda of our office. His email address is jbanda, that's JBANDA at Legat, LEGAT.com. Also, don't forget to submit your AIA number so that we can register you for continuing education. And also to invite you tomorrow, we're continuing our webinar series with institutional design. So please, if you haven't signed up for that, please do. And last but not least, we do have donations to the Leukemia and Lymphoma Society. We're up to $1,830 that Legat will match up to $3,000. So if you would like to donate, there is going to be a link on the chat feature down below, and Justin Banda will put the link so you can donate some money to this very, very good cause. Again, thank you for being part of this, and look forward to seeing you all tomorrow and Friday. Thank you much.
See you soon.